Morning everyone. This morning's poem we're going to look at Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. It's one of the poems in the anthology which really looks at the effects of war on an individual. So in that it links very well with Remains, with Bayonet Charge, with War Photographer, with Exposure perhaps, but also there's the idea there of inner conflict within oneself, the conflict of ideas in your own head, and there's lots of contrasts in the poem between natural imagery, heroic imagery, patriotic imagery, which give a sense of confusion and that inner turmoil that the kamikaze pilot goes through. Before we look at the poem, it's worth noting what a kamikaze pilot actually was. There's plenty of information out there in terms of the context of the poem, and for those from my school I've put that on the O drive in terms of some contextual information. But a kamikaze pilot was a Japanese pilot in World War II, and the Japanese pilots selected their elite pilots to become the kamikazes, and what they were effectively were suicide bombers. They would discharge all of their weapons from the plane on a target, typically a naval target, and then fly their planes into the ships, into the targets, into key enemy strategic locations in order to cause as much destruction as possible. And of course that means that those pilots would never return, but they died heroes. They died doing everything that they possibly could for the Japanese cause in the Second World War. So this particular pilot has been chosen as a kamikaze pilot. Kamikaze. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the fishing boats, strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag, waved first one way, then the other in a figure of eight, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers waited on the shore, built cairns of pearl grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once the tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And although he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Okay, you'll have picked up straight away from that first reading of the poem the desperately sad tone and ending of the poem, and we'll come on to that later in part 3. But we're going to focus on the first couple of stanzas, and in particular stanza 1 in this session. Notice at the start we're being told this story in the third person, her father. It's related by a narrator, perhaps talking to the granddaughter of this kamikaze pilot, reflecting upon the story much later, which gives the sense of distance from the story. Later on that shifts a little to become more personal, more regretful perhaps, but at the moment it's distant, somebody else far in history, disconnected from the family of the storyteller. So her father embarked at sunrise. Let's look at that to start with. We're starting at the beginning of a day. which makes it very different to Remains and to Bayonet Charge, where we're starting in the middle of the action. This is very reflective in its tone, and we start quite naturally at the beginning of the day with sunrise. In literature, sunrise is most often considered to be quite an optimistic image, a symbol of new beginnings, of new hope. And it is in this sense too, because we must remember that the Kamikaze pilots were chosen to be elite, like I've said, were chosen to carry out what they felt was their destiny in defeating the enemy. And so it felt like a new hope, a chance to go down as a hero. We must also reflect on that as ironic, because of course this sunrise is the dawn of the day where the pilot is most likely to die, is supposed to die in carrying out his mission on behalf of his country. So there's a contrast there. Again, like all of those great images that I talk about, where you've got as much to get as you possibly can from one image, from one word. Sunrise also very closely links to the Japanese flag at the time. If you think of the Japanese flag now, it reflects the idiom of the land of the rising sun. Japan being in the Far East, gets spectacular sunrises, and the sun has always been central to the flag and was in the Second World War as well. And what was added to the flags I've tried to draw here are sort of beams, rays of sunlight coming off the rising sun. So sunrise also here takes on a patriotic tone. The belief that this kamikaze pilot is acting on behalf of his country, acting heroically to bring glory to his nation. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. We've got an interesting juxtaposition that I've set out here with sunrise, a samurai sword, shaven head, and incantations. These are all images connected with Japanese patriotism. The samurai warriors were historical warriors defending Japan. The shaven head was a symbol of glory, a symbol of masculinity, a symbol of dedication to the Japanese emperor. The Japanese religion was one of emperor worship, and it all ties into that idea of being patriotic, and the shaven head was a mark of submission to the emperor and glory in your own country. So we've got the samurai sword, the shaven head, incantations, little chants that would have been deeply spiritual in reflecting the kamikaze pilot's last day on Earth, but a day of supposed glory to do what he must for his country. And yet we contrast that with, we could take sunrise onto this side as well. It seems, I mean, it is an everyday image, isn't it? The image that day starts with the sunrise, but also the flask of water. It seems quite mundane, doesn't it, in comparison with what the kamikaze pilot has to do, that he still needs his flask of water to allow him to keep hydrated through his mission, and no doubt what was a hot cockpit, and enough fuel. The fuel, again, it seems such a little thing, but so necessary, of course, for the plane to carry out the distance it needs to do. And yet fuel is one of those images that has two sides to it, because fuel, of course, is explosive. And there is in that image as well both the mundane and the sense of a catalyst for death, a catalyst for destruction. And so we've got those juxtapositions between the normal, the everyday, and the patriotic, the glorious, the heroic for this kamikaze pilot. And then the key quote for this part: enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. So straight away we've got the idea of an ominous tone. We know, because of the context, reflecting on the story, that the kamikaze pilot was supposed to die. But it does set that ominous tone that by the end of that day, that man will be history. He will be dead. But also, that has the sense that he's gone down into history, he's become famous, he's become heroic. And there is that sense of magnificence, that sense of heroic, that sense of patriotism that comes into the journey into history. He's going to be part of what makes Japan great, of what links to the overall war effort for Japan. So that whole first stanza there establishes two different tones. It establishes the tone of the patriotic, of the glorious, of the heroic, and there's plenty there that suggests that's what the Kamikaze pilot was thinking about. But there is the sense of him as a person as well. He's thinking about how much fuel he needs. He's thinking about how much water he needs to take on. And sunrise, as we'll look at in part 2, sunrise is one of the start of a series of natural images. And natural images for the Kamikaze pilot, in this case, are both patriotic and normal, but later on, all of those double meanings come through in clearer detail that actually make him start to think twice about whether he's doing the right thing in terms of his Kamikaze mission.